And I
1, 2, 2, test. All right.
said we reland.
Okay.
Oh
We're good.
my.
Okay. I think we're ready to go. Once I get my mic on here. Okay. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. All set?
Yep, we're
All right.
going.
Okay. We're gonna get started.
Okay.
So before we get going, though, I'm gonna have you say your name and spell it for us.
Okay. Right now.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Elizabeth Gladden, capital Elizabeth. Gladden, Gladden.
Great. Thank you.
The
And
first year I was there, I was a teamster. I was unmarried. I was, and then we got married this second year.
okay.
So my maiden name was Feimster, so the Social Security people told me to keep the F. Not originally my middle initial was an E, but to keep the F of the maiden name to keep their record straight.
Sure. Right. And how did you spell your maiden name?
Feemster.
Okay, great. Thank you. All right, and my name is Robert Bauman, and we're conducting this oral history interview on July 7th of 2014 on the campus of Washington State University, Tri-Cities. So I guess let's start with maybe how you found out about what you were doing before the war, maybe, and how you found out about an opportunity to teach at Heart Mountain.
Okay, as I said, Pearl Harbor is the one that started it all. And from there, the Army thought that the Japanese on the West Coast would be a danger, that and they wanted them moved. And we found out later that that wasn't true, that they really weren't a danger, that the California just wanted the Japanese out. And this was a good opportunity to get them out. And I was teaching in Nebraska when Pearl Harbor came along. And then I finished that year, and the next year I moved to a town called Osceola, Nebraska, which was a little better opportunity. And I taught 1 week when I got a call from the Davis Teachers Agency telling me that he had a good job for me in Wyoming. And it sounded very good because I was getting $1,000 there, and out in Wyoming I would be getting $2,000. So I just doubled the pay for a couple months more work. My father thought I was coming to the end of the world, going to the end of the world. But I resigned then at Osceola, and I don't think the school board was very happy with me, and packed up and came out to Heart Mountain. And it was, I think, the second week in September when I got out there. Some of the teachers had gotten there already. The principal and school and superintendent had been on the job for several months and had tried to get everything organized so that we could be an accredited high school. And then we started school, I think, the first week in October. The time, several weeks I was there beforehand, we sorted books and got assigned to our classrooms and got things set up.
Do you remember what your first impressions were when you arrived at Heart Mountain?
What?
Your first impressions of the place.
Oh, I remember writing the folks and saying that it was all right if you looked up. The sky was pretty and blue, but not if you looked around. No, it was very, very bleak. It was hot, and all you saw were these black tar paper barracks. And you just saw the trainloads of evacuees coming in, and you felt sorry for them.
And what sort of housing did you have there?
Well, the first year we lived in Cody, Wyoming, there was no gas, so people weren't traveling. So we lived in what do you call it? It was a motel, the motel, and a lot of the faculty lived there. There wasn't enough room on Heart Mountain yet. They had built dorms out there, and some of the single people were out there in dorms, but there were no apartments for the married people at all. And then in the next year, we had a fairly nice apartment, except ours also was not dust proof. We had lots and lots of dust, but we did have electricity and water and a refrigerator, and all the evacuees had when they arrived was a big room. The rooms varied in size depending on the size of the family. Some of the rooms were 20 feet long, and some of them much smaller, depending. The families varied from 6 on down to single. They had one light bulb hanging down from the ceiling, no running water. The latrines and the showers were all outside. There was one for each block, and there were 20 blocks. So it was pretty cold. They said some of the mothers didn't get anything done but bundling up their children and taking them out to the bathroom and back in again. It was pretty sad.
And for the single people, were there sort of separate dorms for the single people?
No, the evacuees were in the same ones, but they had a smaller apartment.
Oh, okay, I see. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay.
They say the women went to work immediately, getting sheets and so forth, dividing up the space so they'd have a little privacy. And I guess the latrines at first were just wide open. There was no privacy in them at all. But the Japanese were quite ingenious. They began to do things. They said the Montgomery Ward and Sears Roebuck got a lot of money from tools that the internees had ordered. And some of them were trying to patch up the leaky holes in the barracks and so forth. They had one pot-bellied stove in each room, and then do adequate heating jobs, of course. Of course, that's what we had too up on the hill. We had a pot-bellied stove.
And so what did you teach then when you...
I taught English, and I also had a math class. I taught freshman and sophomore English and algebra.
Mm-hmm. And about how many students did you have in a class?
Well, some of my classes were quite small, and but they never got over 25 or so. Mm-hmm. They were pretty good. And I would say that the discipline was heaven. We had none of the discipline problems that I had when I got back to Pasco. I think they were all kind of beaten down at that point, and they seemed cheerful, but I don't know, they must have thought they couldn't get by with anything because they were very good. And of course, the original schools were in the barracks, and there were no desks. They had the long benches that the kids sat in, and they had to do their writing on their lap. And I had an assistant to help me grade papers, which was nice because I'd never had that before.
So the whole time you were there were no desks?
Well, just in the barracks. In 43 then, the high school was built. And it was heaven compared to what we had. It was it went up within a year, but it had a big administrative building and a section in the middle, and then it had 2 big wings on it, and one they had a home ec department in one section. They had a shop. They had a science department. They had a big gymnasium and auditorium combined, and we had enough textbooks finally. So it was very, very much improved over the first year.
And what about eating facilities? Were there cafeterias, mess halls? Something?
No, the kids always ate in the mess hall. You see, each block had its own mess hall, and where they would go along with their bath facilities, and they would go to the mess hall to eat. I might say that at first there was a little unrest. They claimed they weren't getting the proper food and so forth, but they kind of worked with the administration, and later they didn't seem to complain so much about the food. So well, then we had a separate cafeteria up on the hill where we ate at noon, and we complained because the meat was always lamb, and I was so tired of lamb when we got through.
I guess that's what was available in Wyoming.
Right, yeah. Well, another thing that's of interest when we're talking about food is that they had their own chicken ranch down at the bottom they put in, and they also had a bunch of pigs down there. And the second year, the fall of late summer 1945, they took over the land across the street, across the highway, and they put in a huge garden, and they had every kind of vegetable imaginable down there. And the people around Cody said that it wouldn't grow there at all. But we had an abundance of fresh things then. And it was in the fall of 1944 rather, when it got really cold and they were afraid the potatoes were all going to freeze. So they dismissed school and they plowed up all the potatoes, and the kids went out and picked up potatoes. The faculty too.
So about how many internees were there?
We had 10,000 in the camp, and there were times when we had about 10,700. There were 120,000 Japanese that were evacuated. If you had a sixth of a Japanese blood in you, you were evacuated.
And obviously, all the internees were from the West Coast. Were they mostly from California?
All along the coast. There were some from Washington along the coast that went down. They were also taken. There is this movie, maybe you've seen it, that is very, very good. A number of years ago, and I can't remember the name of it, that is based on a family that was evacuated from over on the coast.
Mm-hmm. And so there were some residents there from the Tri-Cities area, right?
Well, yes. My understanding is that the Columbia River was the dividing line. Everybody west of the Columbia River went. But some people east, and I know there were a couple of families in Pasco, went because they were afraid. The sentiment against the Japanese was very, very bad, and they were afraid to stay, and they came back.
Now, did you know these people at all when you were there, or did these people that you heard about later?
No, once the war was over, it was over. Yeah.
So for students who were in high school when they first came to Heart Mountain, but finished high school during the war, were they able to go to college somewhere, or did they stay?
Well, while they were in camp those 3 years, if they had the resources and they found a school that would accept them, college students could go out as long as they went east. And we had a number who went out. And also there were a few of the laborers who went out to get better jobs that we were allowed to go.
So you went there in the fall of...
In the fall of 42, and left in the late summer of 45. Was there 5 years, or 3 years. Mm-hmm.
Overall, how would you describe sort of your experience teaching there?
Well, I would say it's very good. We had a nice social background with other Caucasians, and we knew a few of the Japanese, but somehow we didn't get very... There wasn't an opportunity to get very close to them. I might say that the administration did a great job in trying to get things organized, along with the help of the outstanding leaders in the Japanese community. And they had Boy Scout groups and the Campfire Girls and Girl Scout groups, and they had dance clubs and everything that would keep the kids busy. And when it got really hot, they dug a great big swimming pool, and the kids went swimming. And in the winter, they skated there. Some of them had never seen an ice skate before, and they had great fun ice skating. They couldn't get out on the hills, though, to go sledding. They had to stay in camp. Or I might say there were about 19, I think, guard stations around the camp. And they were up high with very powerful searchlights. And nobody could get out without being caught. And as we went out in and out the gate, we had to have badges on, and the Army was stationed down at the base.
And you mentioned when I was talking to you earlier that you had, excuse me, teaching assistants or assistants that helped you, grading? Or?
Yes, I had two students. They were kids who were already through high school, and they would help grade English papers and math papers. Sakiko Yoshimura and Mitsuku, what's her name now? I've forgotten. I saw it in the book. Yeah, and we kept track of. One of them went back to Japan the minute the camp closed down, and the other one was a seamstress, and she went to California. And when my daughter and I were traveling one day, we stopped to see her, but we lost track of her later. We don't know what happened.
Did you ever get a sense, or any of the internees ever say anything that they expressed any sort of disappointment or anger or anything about being in the camp, or did they not really talk about it?
No, we were told when we went that you'll never get a job in a Protestant school again. If you go teach those Japs, you're through. And they were crying for teachers when we got out. There's no problem.
So once the camp closed, then what happened to you? What did you do?
Well, when the camp closed, when school was over in 1945, in last of May, and all teachers were through. But if you wanted to stay on and they needed you in some other department, you could go. And I was always interested in hospital work. And in fact, that's what I thought I wanted to be when I was growing up, was a nurse. So I went to the hospital, and my husband went to the housing area where they could were boxing up the household goods that the Japanese acquired and putting them on a train. Incidentally, each one was given $25 and a ticket to where they wanted to go, and that was it. But I had a lot of experiences in the hospital, and I was so grateful for the opportunity. Being a Caucasian, I got to do things, administer medicine and do things that otherwise the Japanese didn't get to do. And I remember so well, one of the doctors came in and grabbed me one day, and he says, "Come in, I need you quickly. Lady's going to have a baby." So I was there, and he put out his gloves for me to hold, to put them on. I was the only one in the room besides the doctor, and I got to see a baby born, and that was before I had any children, and it was really, really interesting. And another experience, there was a time there was one of the fellows dying, an older man, and she got me and said, "I think you need to see this." So she took me in, and we watched his last breaths, and when he was gone, she said, "Now we have to take out his false teeth and take him to the morgue." They had a morgue in the hospital. So she said, "I want you to go down with me." And so I did, and shoved him in the freezer there. Then we came back to the room to clean it up, and she said, "Oh, I forgot to put his false teeth in." But she says, "You don't have to go with me this time. I'll go down and do it." She was a graduate nurse, of course. And the salary scale, I don't think we've talked about, was very interesting. There were 3 scales. Now, I was making over $200 a month, and the highest any Japanese internee could get was $19 a month. And some of the nurses got a little upset at one time, but they wouldn't do anything about it. They had set the scale for 19 for professional, and then I think it was 16 for in between, and the laborers got only $12 an hour. They said they couldn't pay the laborers more than an Army pirate. An army pirate got, and that was $20 a day, not an hour. $20 a day. So they didn't make much money. That was one reason they liked to work outside if they could get a job on the outside, because the administration demanded that they be paid the same way as a Caucasian on the outside. The governor of Wyoming wasn't very helpful. He wanted them to be slave laborers practically and work for $12 an hour. And the WRA, that's the War Relocation Authority, said no. They will be, you have to pay them same as you pay Caucasians. So some of them got some extra money that way, if they could be cleared. I mentioned to you the newspaper. We had a fellow who was trained in journalism, and he immediately started a newspaper. It started within a week, I think, from the time he got there. He got his staff together. It was an 8-page newsletter or a newspaper rather, that came out once every Saturday, and that kind of kept the evacuees in touch with what's going on in the outside world, as long as rules and so forth in the camp. And he had some pretty good editorials where he was questioning things, and I do have some copies of those that I'll give you if you want them.
Now, did those newspapers have to go through?
I don't know how much censoring they did. I wouldn't be surprised, but what they had some though.
Now, were there radios allowed in the camp to listen to?
Yeah.
Get updates on what was happening in the world, or whatever. Too?
There were always rumors, We had a fellow up in the dorm area who got the greatest delight out of starting a rumor and seeing how long it took to get around. But they, there were rumors about how there were Japanese on the coast and they were going to invade, and there was balloons that were going to be coming over and so forth and so on, but nothing ever happened. There was never any incident at all.
Do you have any idea how large the staff was that worked at the camps?
Oh dear, I think there were 200 in the administrative area, and teachers. I don't know for a school of that size. It was a big high school. We had the 8th grade in the high school too, so it was a pretty big school, and our classes weren't big. So I remember one summer I taught solid geometry, and I only had about 8 students in it.
And was there a graduation ceremony?
Oh, yes.
When
they graduated, there was a big ceremony. We had a big auditorium, as I said, and which was also a gym. And it was well used, yeah.
Was there a church or churches in the camp?
Oh, yes, there were. The WRA started out with 2 churches, a Catholic and a Protestant. And the Buddhists wanted their church, and 2/3 of the group were Buddhists. And the WRA refused, but eventually gave in. So eventually there was a Buddhist church and the Catholic and the Protestant. We went to the Protestant church and got very well acquainted with the minister and his wife, and we'd had them over for dinner. Nice couple.
Do you remember when you heard about the war ending, or any of that? Is that?
Oh yes, we were eating lunch and when we were eating lunch, it was when Roosevelt was pronounced dead, and my husband was down in the lab because he was always fooling with radios. He was building his own radio, and he came rushing up and said that Roosevelt had died, and this was during the lunch hour. I forget the date. But the war, well, it's an interesting story about how we heard about the war. We were married in 43, and my sister was married in 45, and her husband was working at the University of Chicago in the department. What do they call it? The one where they were.
Manhattan Project, or
Yeah, well, it's part of the Manhattan Project, and he knew what we were doing out of Hanford, but we didn't know that what was going on out of here, and so we were all sitting. The fellows were in the living room, I remember, and we were out in the breakfast nook at York, Nebraska, at my parents' home. And Stanley, my brother-in-law, came running out to the kitchen and grabbed my sister by the arm and said, "Come in and listen to this." He said, "I want you to hear it, and you tell me what you said, what you heard." And she did. And he said, "Well, that's what I've been doing." So that was how we know the war had ended. They dropped the bomb on Hiroshima. They always said Hiroshima, not Hiroshima.
So now, did you and your husband meet at Heart Mountain, or when did?
Oh, I met my husband at the University of Chicago.
Oh, okay.
I was there one summer, and we got acquainted, and we corresponded, and he'd come to Nebraska and so forth. And it was, then he ran out of money. He was working on his PhD. So he took a job at Whitehall, Montana. And he was there the year that I was at Heart Mountain the first year. And then he wanted to come down, and of course I gave him a job, and we were married then.
And so after the war ended, how did you end up in Pasco then? How did that happen?
Well, that was when we stayed in Heart Mountain until the end of or almost the end of the summer. And then my husband was interested in getting a teaching job in Washington. So he started applying for jobs along the Columbia River, any big town. And Pasco was the first one that answered his letter and said, "We have a science job." So.
And what were your first impressions of Pasco when you?
Terrible. Terrible. It was last day in August, very, very hot. We were in what they called the Riverside homes down on the river. Big room. We must have had a refrigerator. I don't remember it, but the cupboards were open. No doors on the cupboards or anything. And of course, there was no electricity. I mean, you couldn't buy any electric gadgets. You do your cooking on a range, and if you can imagine that in the last day of August. Then C.L. Booth, the superintendent, asked me or I said, "Do I have to stay here?" And he asked me what I did, and I said, "Well, I've been teaching school." And he said, "Come on up and we'll give you a job." So then I taught a year, and then we quit to have our family, and then I went back later.
And so you already knew about Hanford before you came here, though?
Yeah, we found out in the end of August, I guess, or in August, whenever that was, when my sister and her husband were there because they had just gotten married.
And so what was Pasco like as a community in the 1940s and 1950s?
Well, we stayed the first night at the new Pasco Hotel on Lewis Street, and before we got our Riverside apartment, and it was pretty hot. I wasn't much impressed. Oh, my husband always wanted to go to Hawaii, and he thought, well, we'll be on our way to Hawaii then. He thought it would be nice to teach over there.
And so you stayed?
So we stayed. Mm-hmm.
So that would be almost 70 years?
Yeah, well, it was 70. I figured out 72 years since I'd been at Heart Mountain, and we came to Pasco in 45.
About 69 years.
About 20 years.
49,
Yeah.
Yeah. So is there anything I haven't asked you about in
Well, I
terms
think
of Heart Mountain or anything?
Well, there was one thing that the Nisi were subject to draft, and they had to fill out a big form, and they had a couple of questions on there that a few of them wouldn't sign. One of them, are you willing to withdraw all allegiance to the Japanese emperor? And the other one, are you loyal to the United States? Would you be serving the army? And there was a committee that formed, and some of them thought their constitutional rights had definitely been tramped on, and that they wouldn't sign, they said, until they were given their freedom back. But the 442nd contingent that you know about, that was so very, very famous, they were all made up of Japanese. And a lot of Japanese took part there. But because of the questionnaire and so forth, and some of them got a little belligerent, they were arrested. And there was one fellow who really wouldn't give in, and he was put in jail for 3 years, I know.
So you knew about that, about the questionnaire, and
Yeah, that happened while we were there.
were there a number of young men from Heart Mountain who did end up going to the military, joining the army?
Oh yes, a lot of them did. Yeah, which I think is pretty wonderful. Where they've been treated, that they would actually go, but they were showing their loyalty to the U.S. They claimed they were still U.S. citizens.
Well, this has been very interesting for me.
Well, it's fun to review it, and I hadn't thought about it for so long.
Right.
But it's interesting.
Did you ever? I know. At some point when you were here in Pasco, did you ever get to know any of the Japanese Americans who lived here who had been in Heart Mountain? Did you ever?
Well, my son or my husband had Jerry Jerry Minatoya, I think, in class in Heart Mountain, and when he got here, he had him in class in high school.
Wow.
There were a number of Japanese families living in Pasco.
Right. Well, I want to thank you for coming in and sharing your experiences and your photos as well.
Well, I'm sorry my voice is so
No,
cracky.
wonderful. Yeah, thank you very much. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome.